Hello, and welcome to the Hudson Library and Historical Society. My name is Autumn, and I cover the nature and film programs here at the library. Before I introduce our guest this evening, I have a few announcements about some upcoming programs. On Saturday, November 16th at 10 a.m., tune in virtually with the library to explore the art, architecture, and history of Amsterdam as part of the Hudson Library's Tour of the Netherlands programming series. And on Monday, November 18th at 6:30 p.m., please join the library for an in-person event with best-selling cookbook author Julia Turshen, who will discuss her newest book, What Goes with What. Julia has written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, Vogue, Bon Appetit, Food and Wine, Saveur, and more. Registration for these programs and more are now open. Please see or call a librarian if you need assistance registering. We would also like to give a special thank you to the Learned Owl Bookshop for being here. You can get a copy of Dr. Roman's Eat, Poop, Die, How Animals Make Our World through them, which you can then get signed after our program. And now for our guest. Dr. Joe Roman is a conservation biologist and author at the Gund Institute for Environment at the University of Vermont. His research, focusing on endangered species, conservation, and marine ecology, has appeared in Science, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, Trends in Ecology and Evolution, and many other journals. Dr. Roman has received a Hertie Fellowship at Harvard University, a McCurdy Fellowship at the Duke University Marine Lab, a Fulbright NSF Arctic Research Scholarship at the University of Iceland, a Bellagio residency, a Fulbright Fellowship in Brazil, and a Science and Technology Policy Fellowship from the American Association for the Advancement of Science, among other awards. He received his PhD from Harvard University in 2003 and has worked along the coast of Alaska, Hawaii, New England, the Canadian Maritimes, Brazil, Cuba, and Iceland. Dr. Roman has presented his work in the U.S. Congress, South by Southwest, and universities around the world. Coverage of his research has appeared in the New York Times, New Yorker, Washington Post, Atlantic, NPR, BBC, and many other publications. Joe Roman is also the editor-in-chief of eattheinvaders.org, a website dedicated to fighting invasive species one bite at a time. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Joe Roman.
What a nice turnout on a kind of chilly Monday, and thank you all for coming. And I'm thrilled to be first time in Hudson. Thanks for that lovely introduction, Autumn. Sorry for the long list of things that I've done. I travel around quite a bit, and we'll be talking about that. In fact, the Fulbright in Iceland was pivotal to the work that I'll talk about today. I'm going to talk about my book and also how important animals are. Maybe you think that's true, but in science, oddly, we often talk about plants, we talk about microbes, but animals are often ignored. It's a nice group here. I can see most of you. If you want to raise your hand, we can make this a discussion too. So feel free to interrupt or ask questions as you wish. So November 14th, 1963, almost exactly 61 years ago, there was a fishing boat off the coast of Iceland, and the cook was on the deck, and he smelled sulfur. He woke up the engineer and said, I'm smelling something. The engineer checked the engine, nothing wrong with it. Then they noticed that they were starting to get caught in a whirlpool, and soon they saw an eruption column off the back of their boat. And it exploded and immediately reached several hundred feet into the sky, and now volcanologists and people around Iceland are starting to get interested. Those of you that know Iceland, it's on the mid-Atlantic ridge, so it's between the European plate and the American plate, and lots of volcanic activity. In fact, the whole island is based on that. So this is what it looked like a few months later. Now there's this eruption column, maybe a mile or more up into the sky, and you can see the black lava at the bottom there. There's pumice, there's small fragments, and now people are really noticing that something is starting to form. There's something exciting going on here, is that it looks like a new island is beginning to form. A French adventurer goes out to there, a journalist, first person to land there, but it was too active. He leaves the island, and then Icelanders go and say, okay, we want to make sure we get that, and people understand this area. They debated the name, and they called it Surtsey. That's for the god of fire, Surtur. So it's giving it a Nordic name to the island. This is what it looks like now. I visited in 2021. So 3 years ago, I was lucky enough to visit Surtsey. And you can see it looks mostly pretty desolate from here. What Iceland did really well, though, is initially some people were thinking maybe we should make this for tourism. But the local biologists and geologists said, we don't have any areas that are brand new right out of the ocean. Maybe this is a place where we can see how life evolves. That actually gets the attention of the Atomic Energy Commission in the United States. They're interested in that time and what it's like, what life, this is the 1960s, early 70s, what life might be after a nuclear blast. So they actually fund research on this island. I was lucky enough to get there in 2021. They only allow about 12 people on the island every year, six geologists and 6 biologists, and I joined the biologists there. So why is Surtsey so fascinating? Well, these are the first 2 birds that were raised on the island. Black guillemots in the early 1970s. I spoke to the researcher, Erling Olafsson, who took this picture. These are his hands, so I guess one of his colleagues took the picture of these 2 guillemots. So these are the first 2 birds. They had alighted on the island for a couple of years, but they couldn't settle there. They couldn't nest there. What's fun about being on the island is that Erling Olafsson is older than the island, and a lot of the researchers are older than the island. So you're walking around on this place, and the island is so young that it's even younger than some of the birds, because some of these birds can live 50 or 60 years. This is what Surtsey looks like, and it looks similar to what it would have looked like early on. Very little plant life. Lava is rich in phosphorus, but it has very little nitrogen. And any of you that are gardeners or farmers know nitrogen is essential for plant growth. The only plants that survive are ones that float in on the water and are carrying the nitrogen in big seed packets. So they bring their own food with them, floating in, and then they can grow there. But if you're a grass, so grass seeds or other seeds would have flown in over from the mainland, but of course they're tiny, they float on, they don't have any nutrients, so they couldn't survive. So that's what it looked like until things started to change, late 70s, early 1980s. Seabirds, herring gulls, blackback gulls, kittiwakes start to nest on the island, right? And a seabird releases about 3 ounces of poop, my technical word, per day, right? On Surtsey, these birds deposit about 60 pounds of nitrogen per acre per year. That's comparable to what a farmer might put on a perennial field, right? Well, a managed pasture. So a lot of nutrients. So again, this is what it looks like without the birds, and that's what a nesting area looks like. 50 times the amount of grasses and other species are growing in that area. It looks completely different, and it feels completely different. You walk on that lava, and it's really sharp. You're in danger of falling. You get here, and it feels kind of like a trampoline. It's the grass is up to about your knees, and this is all coming from the ocean. It's the birds are feeding in the ocean. They're feeding on fish, they're feeding on krill, and they nest here. And this is that seabird colony, and it keeps growing every year because the birds like it too. So the birds are coming in, and that's expanding. The birds bring in seeds on their legs because they also might land on the mainland. So not only are they bringing in nutrients, but about 2/3 of all the plants on Surtsey right now were brought in by seabirds. So they're bringing in a diversity of grasses, and of course with grasses, then you're also getting, insects are now coming there, and that means insect-eating birds are also surviving. All of this really changed in a couple of years after the seabird's nest. This is a quick timeline of some of those species. The sea rocket is a species that is floating in and it's bringing its own nutrients. Northern fulmar was one of the first species to come in. The lesser blackback gull, most common bird there, that's the one that really makes a big difference. That's when the grasslands start to grow. Snow buntings come in. They're insectivorous birds, so with the insects come birds that can feed on that. Finally, common puffins are coming into that area too. They're pretty common on other islands, and I spoke to one of the researchers. He said, in the future, it'll probably be the land of the puffin. As it gets sharper, as this area ages, it's going to be the puffins that take over. We even have orchids out there that have made it. So it's really a phenomenal system. What makes Surtsey so amazing is it's so relatively simple. If you walk around here, if you travel around Ohio, I live in Vermont, systems have been there for thousands, hundreds of thousands of years. It's really hard to tease apart what the impact is of one animal or one plant on the other. Here, it's a relatively straight system. As one of my colleagues said, ecology isn't rocket science, it's a lot harder because it's so complex. Things are changing all the time. Surtsey was brilliant because they maintain this and they don't allow people. In the 1990s, seals started popping there. That's a gray seal, and you can see that green area there. That's from the poop of seals, also placentas. The seals are there, they're bringing nutrients into that area. So you can see these changes from space. That's Surtsey on the right there. At the bottom, that green at the bottom is where the birds are, that seabird nesting area. Might be hard to see a little bit, but there's a green stretch at the top, and that's from the seals. When you have the gulls, when you have the seals, lots of plants. But that no animals is that green line at the bottom, very rare. So for me, this is when I start, this is at the core of the book is that animals actually can make a huge difference if we know how to look and if we allow them to recolonize as they colonize this area. They give us a chance to really look at how ecosystems can be built essentially from scratch. So one of the metaphors I think about when I think about animals, we've heard that plants or forests are the lungs of the planet, but animals are the heartbeat of the planet. There are the arteries. These images here are tagged animals, satellite tags for thousands of animals that are moving across the earth. It's summer now and they're moving north. And now you're going to see them now. Winter's going to come in the northern hemisphere, and you're starting to see animals start to move south. Gives you an idea. And this is, even with the reduced amount of wild animals that we have, they can bring nutrients thousands of miles across the planet. And that really was sort of at the core of how I think the book is framed. Since I was coming to Ohio, I thought about, bringing it local. So what kind of animals might be at play here? Anyone want to throw, I don't know, I've got some ideas, but anyone want to throw an idea out there as animals that might have an impact? Yeah. Beavers. Well, there you go. So I had the right idea. Well said. They are the classic engineers, right? I mean, you can see it when you drive by. If any of you have them on property or you've seen them in parkland, when the beavers come in, they really start to change everything. And it's pretty visible and it changes. It's changing all the time. I've read that beavers were extirpated, hunted out of Ohio by 1830, recolonized in the 30s, and now they're about 30,000. May fit or not, but they are definitely the essential animals that show this because they're feeding on trees, they're building, and they're changing ecosystems. Anyone else have an idea? Yeah. Deer, yeah. So we have white-tailed deer here, I assume. in areas, and certainly in the east, where you have areas where deer are not allowed, the forests look very different from areas where you have abundant deer. Deer tend to feed on the understory, and you absolutely have a different ecosystem when the deer are there. You don't have moose here. We have them in Maine. Moose feed in wetlands, and then they rest up in highlands where they poop, so they can bring like 40 pounds of fertilizer, a single moose, every year. Any other thoughts? Coyotes, yeah. So I don't know how, coyotes new in Ohio, they've been here forever, because they're new to Vermont, but they've been here a long time, right? This is probably like coyote country. Certainly as predators, they're going to affect the herbivores, or the animals that are eating in a particular area. So another good example. The other one that I was thinking of, these were very common, but have now been mostly extirpated, is bison once ranged through most of Ohio. Certainly, I think where we are right now, you would have found bison 100, 200 years ago. This is a picture from Yellowstone. It's really the only place in the United States where we have a large wild population, though there are many others on private lands. And they do something very cool. They choreograph a green wave. You might think they're just following the food, but they will, as it gets warmer, they'll go up into higher altitudes, and then they'll stay in that area, feed on the grasses. They like young grasses, and they'll poop, and that'll keep the grasses relatively low and also feed nutrients. So they're doing something odd. They're actually creating these grasslands as they move. The last bison, from what I read, in Ohio was killed in 1803. And there are now about 12 in Battelle-Darby Creek outside of Columbus. And that, in part, they're there to help restore and maintain the native prairie, because they would have been a part of that prairie system for millions of years. Largest land mammal in the United States. Did you guys hear cicadas this year? Not much. I went to Maryland 2 years ago when there was a really large emergence where it really is incredibly loud. They emerged by the trillions. They're an example of a species that feeds underground, so they're feeding for many years, sometimes 10 to 17 years, and then they'll emerge one time for mating at the end of their lives, and they'll bring those nutrients that they fed on the root system, on the sap of the tree, up out into the forest system. So one of those, I think of the trees like singing trees. I think you might have an opportunity next year, so I hope so, but it really is spectacular. And then that's my dog, an example of species that we have around. That's Zoe, who is moving nutrients around, as anyone that has a dog that walks their dog knows. You're feeding them, and then they're out there and they're peeing and they're pooping. And that is a way, often and dogs have the biggest impact in areas where there are a lot of people. Kind of makes sense. We're out there, they're putting those nutrients out either into parks or along whatever, streets or something like that. But the biggest migration on the planet happens every day. It happens mostly in the oceans, but also in Lake Erie, so also not far away. It's called daily vertical migration. So in green there, you see the plants. Plants are only at the surface because that's where the light is. At nighttime, fish and krill and other invertebrates come to the surface, feed on those plants, and then during the day, they sink several hundred yards beneath the surface, probably to avoid predation. Right, so that's a way to hide. You can't see them, they're hiding, and then they rise up to the surface at night. That's happening every day. Huge amount of trillions of animals moving back and forth through that space. in the oceans, that creates the downward movement. We were talking about nitrogen. That's mostly what I study, a central nutrient. The downward motion of carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and other essential elements, they are drawn down through the biological pump. I learned about this at the University of Florida in the 1990s. I was sitting back of the room, marine ecology, thinking about that. And this biological pump is incredibly important in the oceans, but I realized something was missing from this system. I had studied whales in the 1990s in the Bay of Fundy, and I thought, one thing that's missing is whales do something different. They dive down to feed, they come to the surface, of course, they have to breathe, they also rest, they digest at the surface, and if you're lucky and you ever saw a whale, and you're really lucky, you'll see a fecal plume, which can be the size of the boat, these enormous poops that you see, and I realized at that point, during that class I had taken notes, that right whales, often you'll see mud on their heads because they're diving all the way to the bottom of the Bay of Fundy, several hundred feet down, come to the surface, release that feces, and that can be picked up by phytoplankton or algae, and then krill, the animals that they eat, or copepods, the animals that they eat, will eat that phytoplankton. So this idea of a feedback loop came to me. This was not part of the research I was doing at that time, but it kind of always gnawed at the back of my mind, like, what would be the impact of this pump? Is it something that's comparable to this huge biological pump? I thought about that for a while. I spoke to a colleague of mine, and he's like, yeah, Joe, sure, there's probably nitrogen in the feces, but is it ecologically important, or is it a fart in a hurricane, right? So what, right? It's just released there. But a colleague of mine, Jim McCarthy, was willing to entertain the idea that maybe whales do something important, what we later called the whale pump, bringing those nutrients up to the surface. So the question is, important or just a tiny influence? So what we did is we built a model for the Bay of Fundy and showed that whales bring as much nitrogen into the system as all the rivers combined, and indeed as much as people do in these areas. They go into different areas, but often human feces is pumped out into the oceans. Whales are doing it in other systems that are nutrient limited, so they're providing that nitrogen into the system. So more whales, yeah, go ahead.
Do we know if they preferentially poop at the surface?
So we don't know if it's preferential.
Do they garden?
Yes, that's the term we would use, that they're gardening those systems. That's a very nice leap there. The reason why we think it's really energetically expensive for whales to dive, so they don't stay down any more than they have to to feed, but also they shut down a lot of their internal organs, so they're not digesting. That's how they save energy. So at the surface, that's where they digest. So certainly we think it's always going to be net upwards because they're never going to go down. And I'll show pictures. Yes, it floats, if you're wondering. So it stays towards that surface. We submitted this article. Was there a hand up?
You have rigorous coastal source, atmosphere where I know the atmosphere nitrogen is not a form that is really usable.
Right.
Whales, do they produce nitrogen in a form that is usable for plants?
Good question.
Yes.
Yes, it's like ammonia or urea. It's similar to what we would be using in fertilizer. That's right. So available. Well, I don't have a slide here, but we did test that later. We looked at whether phytoplankton were picking up these nutrients, and yes, good point, and they absolutely can. So we submitted this, and it got rejected. In part because the reviewer said, well, at that time, I was in Massachusetts, you guys are right on the water, you haven't collected any, all you've done is a model. So we're like, oh, all right. You'd never want to hear that, like start again, but we kind of knew they were right, so we did. The next year we started collecting fecal plumes in order to see how much nitrogen and other nutrients were there. Popular Science picked that up as one of the worst jobs in science, whale feces researcher. And truth be told, if you get right whale feces on your clothes, you can't wash it. You're just going to have to throw it away. But you get to spend a day out on the water, and on the other hand, a bad day on the water beats a good day in the office, as we would say. So I'll push back a little, but fair enough. The challenge with these samples is finding it, though, is being out at the right time. But for me to push back, I will say I think that whale fecal plumes are quite beautiful. They look different. I'm from Vermont, where Snowflake Bentley wrote that every snow crystal is unique. I think the same thing for whale feces. You can see on the upper left, that's bright red from blue whales. On the right, that yellow streak from I think it's a fin whale. Sperm whales here, and that's a humpback calf poop in a friend of mine's hand over there. Great diversity again, but hard to find. We would find maybe one sample a day if we were really lucky. So then one of my colleagues thought, maybe we can use a tool that people use on land to find wildlife or feces on the ocean. And what they did is they brought scat detecting dogs out on the Bay of Fundy. This is Fargo, who was a 90-pound Rottweiler, started his career as a companion to an elderly woman, and when she went into assisted living, he started working as a sniffer dog in the prison system in Washington State, looking for drugs. And then he got what I think is a dream job for most dogs. He became a wildlife detecting dog, looking for grizzly poops and puma poop and all different species in the mountains of the West Coast. I'm not sure if that's a right way there. I'm not sure if he loved this job as much because he got seasick and he had to have Dramamine before every trip. Luckily, his handler was a vet, so she could give him the Dramamine. The amazing thing is he could find 2.5 to 3 times more samples in a day than we could find on the water alone. If any of you guys have ever watched a dog on a scent trail, you see them sort of going upwind, sallying back and forth. They're following upwind. Unfortunately, of course, they can't run on the water, so it's a boat driver who's moving upwind, trying to judge the currents. And when Fargo's on it, he's excited. His very small tail is wagging. Then when you see, that's at the box there, that black box, the X means he's off the scent. So he's not on it. They realize you're off it. Black box, he's on it again. And then the black circle there is when we can smell it. So we can smell it at about 100 meters, 100 yards away. Fargo is getting him at a nautical mile. So really huge tool to help us find more samples. The good news is, as we collected them, we did find, as we had hoped and expected, high levels of nitrogen, phosphorus, iron, and when we did experiments with phytoplankton, it increased productivity. So it does look like these whales are creating this feedback loop in areas where they're abundant. So Fargo was 2005 technology, 2010 technology. New technologies are allowing us to study whales even more up close. This is, I'm going to show you drone footage of a tag going on a fin whale in the Gulf of California. So that's the drone up top. That's a fin whale exhaling. And the drone is dropping a suction cup tag. It's made of silicon, doesn't hurt the whale. You see the whale didn't even react. And that's allowing us now to follow whales, what they're doing underwater, which to me is mind-blowing because when I started out in this field, the only thing we really knew about whales is what we saw at the surface, and that's probably the most boring part of the whale's life, right? It's where it's sleeping and resting. All the interesting things are going on beneath the surface. This allows us not only to see fecal plumes, but also, again, to explore the 3D world of what whales are doing underneath the surface. I think I'm going to show you a slide a video from Hawaii. There might be some sound there. A friend of mine did some music for it. So This is a humpback calf, a newborn calf on the lower right, mom on the top, mackerel scad feeding on the skin that's coming out, and that's mom's peeing, and that's it's not just whale poop, but it's also whale pee that makes a difference. You never get to see that as a whale biologist until you start putting, so again, there's a tag on the back of the calf, who's the lower right, and that's mom up top. And the calf is feeding now, so that's milk. You can kind of see that, the cloudy area on the right, so the calf is suckling on mom. And that's the pectoral fin of mom, sort of stretching through there. And again, you're seeing these fish feeding on the skin that's coming off their legs, and also on the leaking milk. You have to collect the tag at the end, and then you take the camera off there. We're always collecting the tags afterwards. They last about 24 hours. There's mom's throat grooves there. I'd say about this big. I'm use a guess, maybe a little bigger. It's a good question. That's mom again. Calves can't hold their breath as long as their moms can because they're young. So now calf is coming up for a breath. You're going to see Maui here, which is where this stuff was shot in a second. So coming up, and there's Maui in the distance. The next breath, you're going to see the researchers really quickly in a boat watching. And there's the researchers on the boat there. So now you can see like how this is such a game changer to get an idea of how these whales are interacting with the environment and really giving us an idea. And again, there's, I think that's mom up there on the right. So this movement, I've been talking about this up and down nutrient movement, but whales also travel, they have the longest migrations of any mammal on the planet. They're going thousands of miles every year from, for example, Alaska down to Hawaii. They are what's called capital breeders. What they do is they feed for half the year, just all the time, feeding, and then they migrate to areas that are clear, like those images showed, don't have a lot of nutrients, where they have their calves. And we think that might be in part for safety reasons in the high latitudes. There are often killer whales, orcas, that will feed on the calves. So the moms probably are going there in one way. It's also quieter in those waters. The sand might help absorb it. So they're bringing, we call this the great whale. The other thing was the whale pump, this conveyor belt, the idea that these whales are moving nutrients from high latitude, super abundant regions with a lot of food, to low latitude areas. If any of you have spent time in the Caribbean or Hawaii, those clear waters are an indication that there's not a lot of food, right? Not a lot of nutrients or nitrogen. These whales are releasing that, as you saw in their pee and as you saw in their skin, also placentas. And just like any other mammal, infant mortality can be high for these whales. So the first year of life can be a risky time. They're those carcasses, and that's tiger sharks there feeding on a humpback carcass. Probably died, the sharks can't kill them, so probably had died, but they're feeding on them as scavengers. When whales die in deep waters, this is something that came about only since the 1990s. Hundreds of different species depend on dead whales in the deep sea. More than 100 species found nowhere on Earth, just on dead whales, mostly on large whales. That is Osedox on the top there, the bone-eating worm. It actually doesn't have a mouth, doesn't have a stomach, it doesn't have an anus. It's absorbing the nutrients through that root system, and then bacteria inside of what would otherwise be called a gut are providing amino acids and sugars for the worm, and the worm is providing a safe place for those bacteria. again, this was just fascinating work that only emerged relatively recently, but biodiversity depends on, in this case, dead whales. And we figure about 60% of whales that when they die of natural causes sink to the deep sea and provide these habitats. I gave a very early version of this presentation in Iceland when I was in 2019, when I was on a Fulbright fellowship, and it occurred to me that all the work I do every day can come down to 3 words, basically eat, poop, die. And that's where I said, well, that'll be the title of my next book. So 5 years later, finally made it happen. Mostly, I'm giving you 2 stories, which are the whale story and the seabird story, but others include salmon migrating upstream where they're fed on bears and they bring those nutrients again from the ocean into the mountain systems. 2 examples of species that can really have a big impact. I do unfortunately have to give you a reality check. Because you might think, well, I don't see that many wild animals. I don't see the impact it is. That's because only 4% by weight of all mammals on the planet are wild. That includes whales, that includes the deer, that includes the beaver. Almost all of it are people and livestock. 96% of all mammals on the planet are us and the things that we eat. So we are the dominant factor. It's not as strong for birds, but similarly 70%. For me, my dream as a conservationist is to try and bump that number in whatever small way I can a little bit higher. Can we share the planet with these wild animals? We've shown that we can take over. Is there a chance that we can restore them? I'm lucky because I studied large whales, and across my lifetime, I've seen that we can actually make this difference. Raymond Chandler's a crime author, and he wrote all great stories or great crime stories are stories of redemption. So can we redeem this? And the truth is we can, and we have. Here's an amazing story. Northern elephant seals found in the northern Pacific, only about 20 because of overhunting in 1900. This picture here shows there are probably more elephant seals in this photo than there were in the world in 1900. Treaties between Mexico, Canada, and the United States protected them from hunting, and they're now about 180,000, as many as there ever have been. So here's an example of a species that can bounce back. We can do this for lots of other species as well. I grew up in New York. I never saw a whale growing up. I didn't see seals there either. Humpbacks are there, fin whales are there. There are lots of species that are returning there, in part because the waters are a lot cleaner. You guys know that from Lake Erie, same thing, right? Think about what the waters were like 50 or 60 years ago to compare to what they are now. Animals react to that, protecting those animals and better fisheries management so there's more food for them as well. And you can see that over a couple of decades. Maybe one of the best cases of rewilding are the northern sea otter. Have anyone seen sea otters, been to Alaska? Yeah, a few people, right? I'm willing to bet, unless you went to really remote Aleutians, that those sea otters were transplanted from a small island in the Aleutians before an atomic blast. Conservationists in Alaska told the Atomic Energy Commission, if you guys can fund this, we will move these otters back to areas where they had been extirpated. So across most of Alaska, or whether it's the Pacific Northwest, that was the consequence. They didn't call it rewilding then, of restoring species, of returning those to vast areas, 50,000 or more descendants of those few hundred sea otters that were moved there. And it's not just the otters. I haven't spoken a lot about eating today, but for otters, they eat 25% of their body mass every day. That would be like if your dog ate a quarter of its body in food every single day. They have a big impact. They have a high metabolism. They're in cold waters. These are what is called sea urchin barrens. In the absence of otters, you have urchins are their favorite food. Urchins take over. when otters are restored, and this is one of the classic examples of ecology, kelp forests returned. And you see that through vast areas. That has consequences for the fish in the area, for the invertebrates in the area. Urchin populations go down, and you're seeing an increase in biodiversity throughout these areas, again, in a relatively short time. So restoring native species can have a big impact both on the diversity, but also on, to some degree, on carbon sequestration, because when these large kelp forests grow and die, a lot of that carbon can go into the deep sea. We're still working that out. This kind of idea is happening around the world, yeah.
What about the impact of COVID when everyone was isolated and apparently a lot of animals, birds, and so forth came back?
There were certainly some, you saw that in some urban areas or suburban areas, you saw animals returning. You know, COVID didn't, there was some changes. I don't know if there were changes in total numbers, though. You know what I'm saying? Like they were sighted more. I think in some areas, animals did get a bit of a break. Sadly, there was that, I showed you that picture of Fargo. That work, some of that work was done during 9/11. And they happened to be out on the water. And before 9/11, there was a lot of noise. After 9/11, the noise went down, and you could see the animals reacting to that. So I imagine COVID had some short-term impact, is my guess, though we're still figuring that out. What we do see is when you're returning these animals to different places, biodiversity can increase, the diversity of wildlife, the diversity of plants can change, and also either more carbon is sequestered or in other areas more resilience. I didn't talk about parrotfish today. These are large fish that are found in tropical systems. They feed on corals and they poop sand. And if you are going to a tropical island this winter, especially in Hawaii or in some other areas, it's likely you're sitting in fish poop, I hate to tell you, but it's the sand that's passed through these. So in a lot of ways, this is a picture from Surtsey. One way to think about it for me is, can we replace our carbon footprint over time with the tracks of wild animals? And with that, happy to take questions, conversation, or whatever. Thank you all. Yep.
The tags that you place on the humpback,
Yep.
I think you said they'll stay there for about 24 hours. How do you retrieve the tag?
There's a tag. So there's basically a satellite tag. You saw, I don't know if you probably couldn't see it, but there's like an antenna. And so also you can use like a local radio telemetry. So, you know, if you've seen those pictures of wildlife biologists sort of scanning, you're listening for the blips that are coming off that. I've been on the water when they're really valuable and the data is really important. We've spent 24 hours looking for those tags. Ideally, you're following the whale and you're retrieving it right away. But that's how you've got some kind of a tag on it. Yeah. Either, go ahead.
So you said that the tags only work for 24 hours. Do you have to search for the tags that in between the 24 hours?
Yeah, so we're following, do you remember that when you saw that humpback whale surfacing and you saw the biologist, they saw that boat? They're following that whale. So generally what we're trying to do is always follow it. So it's always within, not too close, but within reasonable distance. So that's basically when it works well. They can stay on a little bit longer. The nice thing is, you know, they really are, if you've ever used a suction cup, they don't hurt the whale at all, and they're relatively, when everything works well, easy to retrieve. And it's giving you not only that camera image, but depth when they're feeding, the temperature in the water, and all kinds of other, and sound also.
How deep do the whales feed?
So depends on the species, but sperm whales can go more than a mile down. So they're deep feeder, and they're bringing nutrients from very deep waters up to the surface. Whales are lazy like people, So they'll feed at the surface if they can, like any animal. If there's food at the surface, they'll feed there. But if not, they'll feed a mile or even deeper and stay below for 20 minutes or 30 minutes beneath the
Somewhere else,
surface.
don't they like do a spiral, so
Mhm.
herd the krill?
Yeah.
That's usually at the surface, but so the krill go down.
Right.
And the whales follow them, and then they chase them to the surface?
Yeah, so that's called bubble net feeding, and there's humpback whales that do that. It's very cool. It's like tool use. They'll dive beneath the food, so they'll go a couple of 100 yards down, and they'll release these bubbles in basically what looks like a net, a spiral, and that sort of corral, because opening your mouth for a whale is energetically expensive. You want a lot of food if you're going to feed. So that can bring in those the krill or the herring into those areas. Yep.
Just a comment on that bubble netting, that's done by one whale at a time,
Mhm.
while the others that are in the pod come up, and it's isolated to just the northern humpback.
I didn't know southern humpbacks didn't do that. Very
I
cool.
wanted to ask you
Uh-huh.
a question about more local. We're having a precipitous loss of birds.
Hmm.
Okay, it's estimated as 3 to 4 million less birds,
Wow.
and it's not getting any better.
Hmm.
Our Summit County Medical Parks has a robust program on wild backyard, trying to get people to reduce the grass,
Mhm.
bring it back to a natural setting with native plants and things like this. Do you think those types of projects are hopeful to return habitat that's
Yeah.
lost and a major cause of the loss of birds? Or is it really just destiny that we're going to not see them?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think we see those changes when we try. A good example are wetlands and ducks, for example. There's an exception for the most part to bird populations. They were down about 100 years ago, and by the duck stamps, by funding habitat protection and restoration, you saw those populations come back. That was done by local groups as well as governments as well as individuals. So I don't see any reason why we couldn't do the same on habitat areas. Places like Vermont, we see, I don't know what the total bird population is, but we've certainly seen native forest cover return in the past 150 years. Now it's starting to go down again. But careful stewardship of land is, to me, absolutely essential. Yeah, yeah.
So do you think our current common practice of what we do with our canine poop, are we wasting a valuable resource?
Carl, I don't have an answer to that one. I confess that we pick ours up. We live in a town, so yeah, I mean, so,
It could be
Right.
distributed to they could have poop repositories.
I know. I mean, I don't think it's a bad idea. It's silly to throw it in a landfill, right? Certainly we have composting toilets for people in some areas. You could see the same thing, composting. It may even exist. I don't know, but fair enough point. I saw a hand up in the back. Oh,
Yes.
go ahead.
The newly formed island off of Iceland, you had mentioned that researchers want to preserve the island to study what essentially the island will become up to a natural habitat. I noticed that you said that 2/3 of the plants that are grown there
Mhm.
ride on the island naturally. I was curious to know what the last third was.
Oh, yeah, good question. So it was 2/3 by birds, and then either by ocean, like the ones that I had described, or just by wind. So one secret is that there was one plant on the island one year that the researchers couldn't identify, and they brought it back, and it was a tomato plant. And that, you can guess, it was near the latrine, the people's latrine. Now, if you want to know, you go to the low tide, you go to the ocean if you have to go to the bathroom. So all of them, as far as we know, were either through wind, ocean, or birds. Yeah.
So one of the things about the birds in Ohio is that we have a lot of migratory species.
Mhm.
And as you mentioned, to get all of those elephant seals back, you have to have multiple countries agree to take care of these migratory birds.
Yeah, I mean, so the good news is there's a Migratory Bird Protection Act, which does also involve Canada and Mexico, but that doesn't include a lot of other countries where some of these birds travel to. I certainly don't have like I don't have a short answer to that one beyond first knowing where they go, which is these tags all those images I was showing you guys come from tags, including for birds, which have gotten tiny now, so you can put them on very small birds. So the first thing you want to know is where they go, right? And the second thing, the second thing is, well, what's the habitat? What are the risks there? And then the third are figuring out ways, and they can be, policy, government, local stewardship, all of the above. Like, for example, we haven't talked about monarch butterflies, but efforts, for example, in Mexico now to look at alternative habitat, other places where they can be protected. So no easy answer there, but a very good one, and one that we absolutely need to be mindful of if we're trying to protect these species. Yep. How long in a day do they spend eating? Excellent question. I don't know that one either. You guys are good. How long in a day do sea otters spend eating? It's a lot, but they are up there going, they're feeding all the time, and they're often, almost always feeding on animals that are at the bottom. Benthic, especially, they like urchins, they like crabs. So I would be surprised if it wasn't at least a quarter of the day and maybe more that they're feeding. Excellent question. We could probably look that up. Google could answer that if I don't know that. There you go. Okay, that's a third.
Wildlife, Davis.
There you go. It's a third. I wasn't that far off.
So the drone drops the tag on
Yeah.
the whale, and its suction cuffs on, lasts for 24 hours. And how do you retrieve it? I mean, if the drone doesn't go back and pick it up, you
Right.
can't come in and try and get close to that big whale with a little boat.
Yeah, no, it goes off the whale.
Okay.
So you definitely don't want to approach the whale again. That's the good news. So though you do that would, for many reasons, that would not be the right way to do that. But it's sort of like a bird. The suction is released because of the way the tag is designed, and then it's floating at the surface. Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. Again, these are expensive, and there's a ton of amount of time that's gone in it. You do not want to lose that tag if you possibly can. Yep.
I'm interested in the impact of the animals on climate change.
Mm-hmm.
And climate change is such a difficult thing to analyze.
Mm-hmm.
How can you analyze and figure out what the impact is?
That's an excellent question and one of ongoing debate among scientists. In a very short, one way is first, and I think this debate is my colleagues who are very enthusiastic about it will do kind of like what I did with a model and say, okay, for example, mountain lions feed on deer and deer feed on grasses. And what's the impact of mountain lions? Just to throw one out. The problem is that in some areas, it can have a positive result in carbon sequestration. In other areas, the impact might be relatively small. A better example are wolves. Wolves in Yellowstone might have an impact. They were restored there. In other areas, boreal forests, they would have a different impact. So it's complicated, and again requires looking at individual places, at individual species. I wish there was a blanket answer to this. I'm a little more skeptical on the widespread impact. I'm more optimistic about the ability for these animals to mitigate climate change. The parrotfish, for example, where they are bringing so much sand into areas that it's possible that they're going to allow islands in the Pacific to be resilient against sea level rise through that system. Not the clean answer I would like. That image I showed you, that paper is far more optimistic about the impacts of that. Someone in the back had a hand up for a while.
I'm wondering about the pathogen
of excrement, do you find when there are large like pods or colonies of birds or whatever, that disease transmission is an issue?
It's not something I really looked at. I think it has to be, given how when we look at large populations of humans, for example, or domestic animals. And so and certainly it would have an impact on parasites, a transmission of parasites. I imagine some pathogens are definitely passing through that system, and one worth looking at, but one that was not my area of expertise, but absolutely, of course, gastrointestinal disease can pass through, yep.
Did you say in your one slide that 96% by weight of animal species are human and domesticated animals?
Not animals. Insects far outweigh all of us and all of the mammals. Mammals, just of mammals in that regard. Yes, it's still a stunning number, but there are a lot of other animals on the planet. We are probably relatively small if you include insects and vertebrates and everything else. Yeah. 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 You. Mm-hmm.
So, with like global warming and stuff, it would like affect. Would it affect like if it would affect like migrating of different animals? Would that affect where like they live and where everything like gets fertilized and stuff?
Great question. I've seen that in only 20 years. So that initial example of right whales, I studied those in the Bay of Fundy in the 1990s. Their food disappeared in that area. This is off of Nova Scotia about 5 or 10 years ago. And these whales went all around to the north, to the Gulf of St. Lawrence on the Quebec side to feed. That's in only a couple of years. The bad news for the whales was that there were protections in place for the whales against ship strikes and fishing entanglement in those areas, but they didn't have whales on the other side. So they got caught in crab traps. And they got run over by ships. The good news is that Canada responded pretty quickly, but those changes in migration and the nutrient ecology is changing in real time. It's a really good question, an important one. Yeah.
So I've heard that right now we're in the next great mass extinction event.
Mm-hmm.
So all the biodiversity that we're losing, is anything taking its place?
Well, you saw that slide, so part of it is we are, and our animals are. We haven't spoken about invasive species as well, so movement of species between continents, that certainly might fill an ecological role. Another controversial point, is whether you could have, for example, hippos were brought to South America from Africa, by Pablo Escobar, I think, as pets, and they escaped, and they are invasive in Colombia. They're still relatively small numbers, but some people say, well, we've lost so many large animals, maybe these hippos could replace that. That is not the ideal way, I think, to do this, but sometimes we're going to have to make some tough decisions in that regard. Sure.
So what do
Yeah.
you do on the new Iceland island to protect it from contamination by the scientists?
Oh, they're very strong. You can't, it's forbidden there, so there are laws against landing.
Step onto the land.
Oh, no, you go there, but there's only 2 weeks a year that scientists are allowed there. There's a little hut. And again, there's like one place you can pee, and then you do everything else somewhere else. Everything has come in, the sort of classic, like carry everything out. So, and you do have to, I had to take, so yeah, you take off and you have to make sure that you're not bringing any seeds in or anything like that. So it's about as carefully monitored any place. It feels like you're setting foot on the moon, honestly, the first time you go there. It's really amazing. A great job that they did in protecting that area and giving us insight into these changes. But it requires serious enforcement. Off the top of my head, I'm saying like 25 acres, maybe, but it was larger there, and I might have that number wrong. You can walk from one end to the other in 2 hours along the coastline, and it's kind of tall and high, and it's eroding away parts of it.
How close is it to like the mainland? Will animals migrate across the water to it, or is it too far?
It's way too far for them. I mean, unless they're insects that can be carried on the winds. It's 15 miles to the closest island and maybe 30 miles to the mainland, off the top of my head. Yep.
Is Surtsey the most recently created piece of land in our world? There's been nothing since then?
Good question. So as one of the scientists said, there are lots of rocks in the ocean. What makes Surtsey special? One is its youth. It's one of the young. I feel like there's one off of Japan that's more recent. But what it was is the protection and the careful that they go out there every year and observe those changes. It's still a spectacular place. But eruptions are happening all the time. There's an active eruption in Iceland right now on the mainland. So it's certainly one of the youngest. There may be a couple of upstarts.
Well, you don't know if Japan is.
I believe that Japan did a pretty good job too, as I recall. Yes. Well, thanks everyone for the great questions and.